Hello YouTube. This video is going to argue that, contrary to what some left-leaning people think, the available empirical evidence does not justify the view that racial bias is an important variable in explaining why it is that African Americans are arrested at a higher rate than white Americans. So, to begin looking at said empirical evidence, we can see this 2011 meta-analysis on the probability that a suspect will be arrested and how that relates to their race. The paper looked at 27 different data sets, and they write, quote, that depending on the method of estimation, the effect size for race varied between 1.32 and 1.52. Converting the race effect size to probabilities shows that compared with the average probability in these studies of whites being arrested, which was 20%, the average probability for a non-white was 26%. So the first thing to note here, I think, is that the difference, 20 and 26%, while not nothing, is smaller than some people might imagine. Sometimes racial differences in arrest rates and bias are talked about as if they are much larger than what this data indicates. Now, if we look closer into this data, we see some weird stuff. So in particular, what we see is that the effect size doesn't decrease with time. That back in the 60s, the effect was just as large basically as it is today. Actually, it was a little lesser in the 60s and 70s than it is today, although I doubt that difference is statistically significant. And that is weird just because it contradicts our intuitions about the changes in racism and institutional racism and these sorts of things with time. Now we can look at this second meta-analysis on the same thing, basically, this one from 2014, and it finds, quote, that these values indicate that black individuals were 1.39 times more likely to be arrested. They didn't say this in the study, but if in this study the average rate at which white people were arrested was 20%, as was the case in the first meta-analysis we looked at, this number would indicate that 28% of the black suspects were being arrested. So these are pretty consistent findings, 26%, 28%, not much of a difference. The moderator analysis here is even weirder, I think, because as you can see in this meta-analysis, they looked at the region in which the study was done, and a significant degree of bias was found in every region of the country except in the 7 studies done in the South. This even more strongly contradicts our intuitions about how racism operates in the United States, because most people would suspect the biggest effect to be found in the South. In fact, there was a slight bias in favor of black people that effect size is negative, although it was not statistically significant. And in contrast to the first meta-analysis we looked at, if we look at the decades, in this chart we see that there is a decline with time. In this meta-analysis, the fact that these two meta-analyses differ from each other with respect to this, I think, speaks to a degree of unreliability in this data. Now, I want to bring your attention to this 2003 paper, which was not included in either of these meta-analyses, which itself is interesting. And it looked at the effect of race on the probability of arrest in the case of about 335,000 crimes that were committed across 17 states in 1999. Normally, we wouldn't bring up single studies and then contrast those with the results of meta-analyses, but because this sample size was so large, I think it's worth doing. And as we can see in the abstract, they write multivariate logistic regression shows that the odds of arrest for white offenders is approximately 22% higher for robbery, 13% higher for aggravated assault, and 9% higher for simple assault. It goes on to say that there was no difference found with respect to rape. And we can see that that is all accurate. The abstract accurately reflects what the regression table suggests. So, this particular line of research has several problems. Firstly, there are inconsistent results in large sample studies, and that's never a good thing to see. We'd expect a lot of variation in results if these studies had very small samples, but we're seeing meta-analyses that contradict each other, studies with hundreds of thousands of participants that aren't included in these meta-analyses that showed radically different results. That's not a good thing. There needs to be an explanation for this. That explanation would be discovered ideally in an analysis of moderators of variables that predict the results of these studies. But the moderator analyses that we saw did not adequately explain this kind of variation in result. In fact, the moderator analyses that we saw were weird. As I pointed out, they suggested things that just don't fit with the more broad hypothesis that the left has about how racism operates in the world, or in America anyway. And these studies all suffer from inadequate controls. So what I mean by that is that we want to compare apples to apples. We want to compare black and white people who are the same in every way except for their race, and then see if black people are more likely to be arrested. The things that affect your probability of being arrested, I mean, there are tons of them. There's where you committed the crime, the way in which you committed the crime, how you went about concealing the crime, the way you interact with law enforcement when they question you, all of these sorts of variables, which are not controlled for in any serious way in any of this research. And because of this, it just cannot be used to reach any firm conclusion. And then on top of that, this research does not have any serious treatment of publication bias. Publication bias is a tendency found in many research literatures whereby positive results are more likely to be published than null results. And that is going to inflate any estimate of racial bias we have. There are statistical techniques you can use in meta-analysis to detect and control for the influence of publication bias in a literature. But unfortunately, the meta-analyses I was able to find on this did not do that in a rigorous way. That isn't to say that they didn't talk about publication bias at all. They did. I don't want to go into the technical details here, but the ways in which they talked about it and dealt with it were about as non-rigorously as you could. And they were employing methodologies that generally today are not taken as good controls for publication bias. Now, I want to bring up a little bit of research which attempts to control for behavioral characteristics in these sorts of analyses. This is a paper from Beaver et al. In 2013, and in the abstract it writes, analysis of these data reveal that African American males are significantly more likely to be arrested and incarcerated when compared to white males. This racial disparity, however, was completely accounted for after including covariates for self-reported lifetime violence and IQ. And we can see here the result in the baseline model before they controlled for these things. The probability of arrest in this sample was 41% for whites, 49% for blacks. In the multivariate model, when they controlled for these things, the arrest rate for blacks lowered to 44%, and the difference, that 3% difference, was not statistically significant. Now, it's worth emphasizing that one of the covariates used here is lifetime violence. That is not the same thing as criminal history, because this includes violent acts for which they were not arrested, and it does not include crimes that were nonviolent. So this is trying to get at the individual's antisocial personality traits, basically, and aggression, and in general propensity to violence, and maybe probably ties into impulse control and these sorts of things. We can see an earlier result here from the book The Bell Curve, and it's only controlling for IQ, but what it finds is that the probability of incarceration was 2% for whites, 13% for blacks, and 6% for Latinos, at least among men of age 29. Now, once they controlled for IQ, these differences shrunk considerably. 2% for whites, 5% for blacks, 3% for Latinos. Now, these sort of general behavioral controls, IQ, violence, these things might control for how people interact with police and the ways in which they commit crimes, right? Because an offense type, say assault, there's a great deal of variation within that type in terms of just how violently it was committed, the way in which it was committed, again, the way in which it was concealed, which we could see IQ being relevant to that, although I don't know how you would really conceal an assault, but other crimes are more concealable than assault. And these analyses, the Bell Curve one, the Beaver et al. Paper, they reduced racial gaps an awful lot, but they didn't control for traditional confounders. Now, if we were seriously testing bias, what we would want to do is the following. We would control for the traditional confounding variables that lots of studies control for: criminal history, offense type, and income. We would control for neighborhood effects, which shockingly few studies control for, right? Because some neighborhoods are more policed than others. And within those neighborhoods, we might want to ask, are black people at an elevated arrest risk relative to white people, again, among those who live in the same neighborhood and who have the same criminal history, offense type, and income? And then we would also want to control for psychological and behavioral traits that might predict the ways in which people commit crime and the ways in which they interact with law enforcement. Obviously, we would then want to replicate that research, and then we would want to seriously test that research for publication bias. Unfortunately, nothing like this has been done. This is not what the research literature here looks like. But if you look at the size of reduction in effect that is gotten by controlling for these traditional confounders like criminal history, offense type, and income, and you look at the degree of reduction that is gotten in studies that control for psychological and behavioral traits, well, it would be very unsurprising if a literature that combined those two sets of controls consistently produced statistically insignificant results in terms of the differential probability of arrest by race. And indeed, as we saw, Beaver et al. Did reduce that gap to statistical insignificance, but because it was only one study, we can't tell if that is because there actually is no difference once you make those controls, or if it's just because the sample size wasn't large enough, and if you did several studies just like that, or did one with a larger sample size, you would consistently find that 3-point gap that they found even after applying their multivariate model. But what would be, again, most impressive and most useful would be one that combined the Beaver et al. Controls with the normal controls, and then showed us the remaining gap. Now, another kind of research in this area involves comparing arrest rates to victimization data. Victimization surveys are surveys that ask people to describe crimes that they've been the victim of within the last year. They provide an account of not only the crime, but the perpetrator, the race of the perpetrator. This survey is carried out by the Justice Department, called the National Crime Victimization Survey, and they provide an estimate of crime rates which are independent of police behavior. We can see here an analysis comparing these two sources for 2001 to 2003, and there's pretty close concordance in most cases, but the general trend, in fact, is for the victimization data to suggest a higher rate of crime than the arrest data would, suggesting a pro-black bias in arrest rates. We see a similar result here, looking at national incident-based reporting and arrest rates. Now, incident reporting is not the same thing as victimization data, because incident reporting, these are incidents reported to the police, though they don't all actually lead to an arrest. So it's similar, but not quite the same. Now, on this victimization data, I'm going to talk about this 2011 paper, which tried to remove Hispanics from this data in a problematic way. The results here are not as reliable because of the way in which this was done, but the data goes back over a very long time span, and so for that reason is somewhat interesting. So it compares the arrest ratios for black and non-Hispanic whites to the crime ratio between those two groups implied by the victimization data. Now, Hispanics are grouped in with whites in government data, so they create a method to remove that effect, but that method assumes that the black, white, Hispanic crime gaps in California and New York are representative of the black, white, Hispanic crime gaps across the country. I don't think that's true. Black people especially seem to have an elevated crime rate in the South, which is not included in these two states. And so I think the method by which they did this is dubious. But they produced a few fun charts. Now, these charts have 3 lines. The clean UCR, that's the Unified Crime Report. That is the arrest data after they attempt to remove the effect of Hispanics. The confounded UCR, that is the data the government just gives you, which is confounded by mixing in Hispanics and whites, and the NCVS obviously is the National Crime Victimization Survey. Now, averaging across the years 1980 to 2008, we see that the crime victimization data implied that black people had a rate of rape which was 2.8 times that of white people's. The confounded UCR data, so government data that included Hispanics and whites together, implied that it was about a 5-factor difference, but the clean arrest data, the data that had been cleaned of that mixing of the Hispanics and whites in the data, that implied a larger gap, 6.35. No matter which of these numbers we look at, what we see obviously is that the victimization data implies a lesser gap than does the arrest data, but if we look at the graph, we can see very obviously that this is not constant across these years, that once we move into the 2000s, there is a great deal of convergence between these lines, especially if we're talking about the confounded line, if we don't care to utilize their method of removing the Hispanic influence from the white crime rate. Although even if we do use their clean line, the lines are pretty gosh darn close once you get into the 2000s. And it's worth noting also, obviously, the victimization data still implies that black people have a much higher rate of crime than do white people. It's just a matter of the degree of that difference. We can see aggravated assault. We see a similar story. There's somewhat of a gap in the 1980s. Into the 2000s, there isn't really a gap, at least if we're using the confounded UCR line. And there is a small gap using the clean UCR line, but it is a lesser gap than what existed in previous years. Now, robbery is really the outlier here, because with robbery, we see 2 things. One, we see a much larger gap between the victimization line and the clean UCR line than we did with other crimes that persists into the 2000s. But we also see that the confounded UCR line and the victimization line not only matched in the 2000s, but matched back in the late 80s. So how we interpret this result really depends on the confidence we have in their method of removing Hispanics from the data. Now, while talking about this, it's also worth mentioning that we should think about how it could be, assuming their method is valid, that controlling for this Hispanic effect makes the result look biased when it does not look biased when we just compare the proportion of arrest to the proportion of the victimization data where they say the perpetrator was black. How could that be? The black data, when it's on its own, is obviously not contaminated by this Hispanic influence. The way then in which removing this Hispanic influence could increase the gap would be that there was a pro-white bias relative to Hispanics, or an anti-Hispanic bias relative to whites, whichever way you want to look at it. The way to make these two data sets consistent is to just note that the bias here, if it exists, is not pro-black, it's pro-white, and it's pro-white relative to Hispanics, not relative to black people. That is how you make those two data sets consistent. If you buy their method, which again, I don't particularly buy the method. And we could also ask the question, should crime and arrest rates even match? Now, black people live in high crime areas. High crime areas are over-policed. Black criminals are bad criminals, and what I mean by that is that they tend to commit crimes in ways that elevate their risk of arrest relative to white people committing the same crime. We'll talk more about that later. And so this should, and here I don't mean that in a prescriptive sense, I'm just saying that, you would expect this to lead to black people being disproportionately arrested relative to the rate at which they commit crimes, because they're committing crimes in crime-ridden areas and they're committing crimes in ways that elevate the risk for arrest. So even when looking at that data back in the 1980s, it's not entirely clear that that is suggesting an anti-black bias. That could just be the result of differences in the ways in which, in the places in which crimes are being committed. Now let's talk about drugs. Obviously, victimization surveys cannot speak to drug crimes because they are victimless crimes. So we have this infographic from Vox. It says that 9.5% of whites had used drugs in the last month compared to 10.5% of blacks. So that's a small difference in drug use levels. But the drug-related arrests per 1,000 residents is much higher for black people than for white people. 332 for whites, 879 for blacks. So this is a very common argument, and it is silly in multiple ways. So firstly, only about 3% of people in state prisons are in prison for just drug possession. About 15% are in jail for drug-related crimes, but most of those crimes are not possession. When you ask people about drug use, you're asking them essentially about possessing drugs, not selling drugs. And then to compare that to all drug arrests, which include arrests for selling drugs, which is what Vox did, that is a misleading thing to do. And we should look at this paper from 1995, published by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. A few interesting things in here. Firstly, it finds that the racial gap in arrest rates is larger for selling drugs than for possessing drugs, because black people make up about 13% of the population. They made up about 36% of those arrested for possessing drugs and about 49% of those arrested for selling drugs. So that little trick that Vox did, where they compared drug use to all drug arrests, that is going to be misleading, because of course there will be a greater gap in drug arrests than drug use if the gap in drug arrests is disproportionately driven by arrests for selling drugs, not using them. This paper also looks at a few other variables that help explain racial differences in drug arrest rates. So they write, with respect to the type of drug used, and notice the Vox didn't differentiate. They just said past month using an illicit drug. What illicit drug? Who cares? As if all drugs carry an equal probability of arrest, which is obviously ridiculous. So they say with respect to the type of drug used, the races differ in ways that place black drug users at greater risk of arrest than whites. Specifically, according to the data, among blacks who reported using illicit drugs during the year, 20% said the drug was heroin or cocaine, the type of drug with the greatest risk of arrest. For white drug users, that figure was lower, 16%. The type of drug with the lowest risk of arrest, psychotherapeutics and hallucinogens, had a higher use rate among whites and a lower use rate among blacks. That is, 19% of black drug users and 30% of white drug users reported using these sorts of drugs. So one of the things that contributes to these gaps is the sorts of drugs that white and black drug users use. Black drug users are disproportionately using drugs like cocaine. White people are disproportionately using psychedelics. Now, the paper also writes, among black drug users, 54% reported using drugs at least monthly, and 32% reported using them weekly. Such frequent drug use was less common among white drug users. Among white drug users, 39% reported using drugs monthly, and 20% reported using them weekly. Of course, the more often you use drugs, the more you're going to elevate your risk of being arrested for using drugs. Vox just asked, have you used drugs within the last month at all? This is not a good way to capture the frequency with which drugs are being used. The paper goes on to discuss a 23-point disparity where black people make up 36% of drug possession arrests, but 13% of drug users. And they say that these variables, which the paper talked about, account for 10 of that 23-point gap. That's not the whole gap, but it's a significant proportion of the gap. We can see a similar thing looking at this paper from 2006. It writes, African Americans are nearly twice as likely to buy drugs, I think this is particularly weed, to buy weed outdoors, 3 times more likely to buy it from a stranger, and significantly more likely to buy away from their home. These results provide an additional explanation for the differential in arrest rates between African Americans and white Americans. They write that the total number of transactions across these 3 groups, and transactions means, I guess, buying weed, the total number of transactions across these 3 racial groups ending in arrest is calculated to be 832,000, of which African Americans represent 32%, whites represent 57%, and Hispanics represent the remaining 12%. Now, it goes on to say, just like the first paper, this does not account for all or even the majority of the difference in drug arrests, but it also clearly shows that we would expect African Americans to be at an elevated risk of arrest, even when looking at people using the same kind of drug because of the ways in which they buy those drugs. Note also that the sorts of variables used here are not identical to the sorts of variables used in the first paper, and that if you combine those 2 sets and combine it with even more sets about the ways in which people use drugs, the ways in which people buy drugs, you might ask a question about, like, where do you keep your drugs? Something like that. We might get an even greater reduction in the proportion of the arrest disparity, which is unexplained. Now, that paper said the black people represent 13% of drug users. This is based on self-report data. People like the people that write for Vox seem to unquestioningly trust the validity of self-report drug use data, which is ridiculous. We can look here at this 2006 study, and there are many studies that have shown the same thing. This is just one example. They took 600 people from Chicago, and they gave them a survey. They filled it out. Have they used drugs recently? If so, what drugs? But once they had taken that survey, they basically surprised them and said that now we are going to give you a urine test and a hair test and biologically determine whether or not you have actually used drugs. And then we can talk about the concordance rate. So at what rate did those two things say the same thing? For cocaine, concordance was 90% among African Americans, 95% among Hispanic Americans, and 99% among white Americans. For weed, it was 87% among African Americans, 96% among Hispanic Americans, and 100% among white Americans. And so, what this tells us essentially is that African Americans are at a disproportionately high risk for being dishonest when asked about their drug use. And again, this has been replicated many times. So, if we wanted to seriously test bias in drug arrests, we would need to administer people a biological test of drug use, not ask them if they've used drugs. We would have to control for the way in which they purchase the drugs, the method of use of the drugs, neighborhood effects, again, where they're using the drugs, the frequency of use, where they store their drugs, just as many things as you could think about that could elevate someone's risk for being arrested. What they do while they're high, and we would have to make sure that we are looking at arrest rates only for drug possession. And when I say only for drug possession, I mean something more than what's been covered so far. I don't just mean officially only for drug possession. I mean, we would also want to remove those people who are being charged of drug possession because they've pleaded down to that from a higher charge, which makes up a significant proportion of the people getting arrested for drug possession. So that is what a serious attempt to try to detect bias here would look like, and this is not what is done. Now, one thing we can do to get at the degree to which racial animus is motivating arrest rates is to compare the arrest rates of black people by the race of the officers involved in making arrest decisions. So that's what this 2006 paper did, and they write the black suspects were more likely to be arrested when the decision maker was a black officer. It's actually even more noteworthy than they let on, because we can see here from their regression table that Model B, when white officers were making the decision, the race of the suspect did not have a significant effect on the probability of them being arrested. So there was no racial bias detected among white police officers, but there was a great deal, actually, as you can see looking at that number, of racial bias detected among black police officers. So returning to this idea of seriously testing bias, whether we're talking about arrest rates for violent crime or drug crime, we need to do all the things I previously mentioned, and we need to examine the effect of officer race, because it could be that white people and white police officers are getting the blame for a bias which, for some reason, is being exhibited by black police officers. Now, the last thing we need to talk about is the default assumption. What I've argued here basically is that the evidence is just not good enough to make a call, but we have some reason to think that if the research was done in a more rigorous way, it would be less likely to suggest that racial bias is present, because the flaws in the data that exist all exist in the direction of inflating the amount of racial bias detected. But if we don't really know, if the evidence is not conclusive, what should we think? Should we just assume that white people or white police are racist until it's proven that they're not racist? Well, that seems rude. But on the other hand, it also seems rude to assume that black people are exactly as criminal as their arrest rates would suggest unless that is proven to be false. Either assumption implies something negative about a racial group, and that seems not nice. Now, in reality, we don't need to make an assumption, right? Because if someone says to us, do you think there's racial bias in arrest rates, we can say, well, that has not been shown to be the case, but we don't really know for sure. And if someone is arguing that it definitively has been shown that it is the case, we can point out the methodological flaws involved in this sort of research. And other than that, this never really comes up, right? This isn't something you have to form a belief about because it doesn't really affect daily life. But if you did have to make an assumption, I'm going to argue that the correct assumption to make would be that the white police are not being racially biased. And this is an empirically driven prior. So we can look at this meta-analysis of 17 previous studies that experimentally tested discrimination, where they had people break into groups. They considered some person, some situation. Will you help this person? Will you vote for this person in a political context? Stuff like this. And one group of people, the person was white. In the other group of people, the person was black. All of the differences between these people were controlled for. And we can see the result of these experiments, and the net result is no bias that is statistically significant among white Americans, a slight statistically insignificant bias in favor of black people, and among black people a statistically significant bias in favor of black people. So to conclude, research on bias in arrest rates is of poor quality and largely ignores racial differences in behavior. It should be noted that that's insane, right? Because racial differences in crime are a racial difference in behavior, and it is eminently plausible that racial differences in behavior are caused by other racial differences in behavior, temperament, and psychology, but these things are largely ignored in the literature. But we know that white people in experimental tests are generally unbiased in behavior. Now, I should specify, this is having to do with behavior. This is not to say that white people don't have some sort of implicit, unconscious, whatever bias, but if they do, that doesn't seep into behavior, which is what those experiments were testing, and police arresting people is a behavior, and so that is the appropriate comparison to make, not a comparison to what white people think. It's how they act that is going to matter here. Now, white people are generally unbiased, and racial disparities in arrest rates are disproportionately driven by the actions of black police officers. So, given these two facts, and the fact that the evidence is insufficient and weak and methodologically poor, if we had to make a bet, I think the rational bet would be to bet against racial bias in arrest rates. Because that is something that offers an explanation for everything. Why does some of the data suggest that there is bias? Well, because if you look at that data, it is methodologically crap. We would expect that white police officers wouldn't be biased because white people in general are not biased in their behavior. And why is it that white police officers are not exhibiting a greater racial bias than black police officers? And in fact, the opposite is happening. Well, because white police officers are not racially biased. Right? So all three lines of evidence here can be explained by that hypothesis. By contrast, the hypothesis that there really is bias going on, it would be more difficult to reconcile that with all three lines of evidence. And again, that's if you have to make the assumption, which in general in everyday life, you don't. But if you do have to make the assumption for some reason, maybe you're fighting with someone on the internet, maybe you're making a YouTube video, that is the assumption I would recommend making. So anyway, that is the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, consider giving it a like or a comment or sharing it somewhere. If you enjoy the channel in general, consider supporting it on Patreon or Subscribestar. But in any case, thanks for the view.